Hey everyone, welcome to Redefining Work podcast. I am your host, Lars Schmidt. And today, this is a really exciting episode. This is a first where we have an opportunity to chat with a co-founder and an investor together. So I'm really excited to be joined by Roxanne Petraeus. She is the co-founder and CEO of Ethena, and Hunter Walk, who is the partner at Homebrew. And let's jump right in. Hunter, I'm going to open with you, and then I'll go over to Roxanne. I'd love for you to just give a quick introduction for the audience, and then we'll jump right in.
Well, I'm really happy that we outnumber you, so Roxanne and I can push our agenda this podcast. Hunter Walk, I am a co-founder and partner at Homebrew, which is a venture capital fund that a former colleague and friend and I sort of founded about a decade ago. And our goal was just basically to hopefully find founders who were working on problems that were large, urgent, and valuable, and of personal importance to them. And then supply them with some capital as they got started, and hopefully, sort of be a force multiplier on the work that they do. So we've been fortunate enough to do that with a bunch of wonderful companies, including Roxanne and her co-founder Anne over at Ethena. I'm a New Yorker who is Bay Area for the last 30 years. So I California, nice, but with New York, fold a slice of pizza and swipe a card on the subway.
I mean, 30 years, like you're in at that point, right? Like you've got your roots, but you're in there.
You get to call yourself a San Francisco local if you stay through a business cycle. And so I guess now with a little bit of a tech downturn, we'll find out, who gets to call themselves a Bay Area local versus has already fled for, Miami or Michigan or whatever.
Yeah. Wow. Miami was, I feel like that was a rush for a while. I feel like I haven't heard the word Miami for, a minute. So that was kind of refreshing until now. But
yeah. You must not be a basketball fan.
I'm a Laker fan, so I kind of checked out already. Roxanne, I'd love to have you introduce yourself for the audience.
Happy to. So Hunter invested in my company, Ethena, way back in the day. Big fan of him and Homebrew. What I do is I'm the co-founder and CEO of Ethena. We provide modern compliance training. Think of all the trainings that a company is required to do. We do it in a way that's really about culture building, helping employees figure out how to do the right thing instead of just check a box. And in previous lives, I was an active duty Army officer and was at McKinsey, bootstrapped a company. I'm a native New Yorker, if we count native as 3 years, but I stayed through the pandemic, so I think that that's like dog years plus. Strong Taylor Swift fan and a mom. I think that's the key points of the bio. Yeah.
I like it. I feel obliged to say that I spent 6 months in New York. That gives me no cred whatsoever, but at least, I understand the lifestyle a little bit.
I was so curious. I was waiting to see if it was, I spent 6 months on tour with Taylor Swift or 6 months in the Army myself, but you picked New York.
Yeah. I went the lowest hanging fruit I could possibly get and took that. I couldn't call myself a Swiftie because the Swifties would immediately ask me for, quiz me on lyrics, and I'd fail, and then it would be bad news for me.
Yeah. Hunter, should we leave?
You're cornered by Swifties on this podcast, Lars.
No, look, I have 2 daughters, so I am like a default. I enjoy her music. I just, you have to have a certain level of fandom to call yourself a Swiftie, and I'm not a poser, so I can't claim that.
I appreciate the authenticity.
Yes. Roxanne, let's come back to you with this first question. You mentioned obviously background in the military. You've been an entrepreneur. You've worked in management consulting, and now you are a co-founder of Ethena. How did all of that past experience prepare you for what you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, it may sound corny, but I think like leadership at its core is pretty constant, like regardless of the setting you're in. Honestly, even if you're a parent, I think that some of the same principles apply. And so I was fortunate that I got to learn leadership in what I would argue is one of the best and toughest environments, which is the Army during wartime. And it's really like some of those same lessons have applied through, I'm building a company that's just inherently challenging. You're bringing people together. You're trying to do something really hard, like Hunter described, backing companies that you're really personally passionate about the mission. Like when you care, you take your wins and those are really exciting, but your losses are super painful. And I think that having the experience of sort of like leading during really challenging times and seeing really incredible leaders and like what they looked like, and I can still remember their facial expressions and how they managed to crack a joke at a time when everybody was, really feeling it. Like I've just been really grateful to have that experience that I can draw on as I've led Ethena through fundraising, through landing our first big logos, through, bank runs and just all of the wild things that founders go through. And I actually feel like, weirdly, some of the lessons that I learned in a really different field have ported over sort of perfectly. And then there's absolutely things that I had to learn kind of on the job, because in the Army, you don't sell anything, for example.
Yeah. Talk about dog years being a founder of the last 3 years.
Yes.
That is also fitting in that scenario as well. Hunter, let me get you in here. Obviously you kind of gave us a bit of the investment, thesis for Homebrew. What was it about, Ethena and Roxanne and their co-founder Anne that kind of got your attention and got you involved?
Yeah, absolutely. We got introduced, and I'd sort of call our decision-making on when to invest or not kind of like a sandwich that kind of goes people, problem, people. So the first people is just, a bunch of, I'd say, almost basic checkboxes about quality, smarts, integrity, things that I believe every investor should or would want in founders. And Roxanne and Anne clearly, checked those boxes very quickly. Then we had to digest a little bit and understand the problem they were solving and their view of the problem. I sort of talked about that for us, problems that we're most interested in, it doesn't necessarily have to do, sometimes people say market size. I think especially for early stage market size, quote unquote, big markets, if all I wanted were big markets, I'd invest in steel and automotive, right? So I really think less about just absolute size and more about what I call sort of, I guess somebody once told me unintentionally, it's the LOVE framework, LUV, large, urgent, and valuable. Large, is there a size to this, whether that's currently expressed in spend or not? Urgent, does your customer, are you solving a problem for your customer that's one of their top 3 issues, right? There's a difference between, we asked 100 people if this was a problem, they all said it was a problem, versus it's what they get up, trying to solve, it's what their job or career depends on, it's what their bosses or board is asking them about. And then valuable, can you capture, some percentage of that value that you create? In Ethena's case, it's interesting. Obviously, it checked enough of those boxes for us to invest, but I think each of those, there's a glass half empty, half full version of it, depending upon, on paper, what you thought they were trying to build versus when you meet them and you hear their vision for Ethena, you get the half full version as opposed to the half empty one, which isn't, hey, we're trying to solve sort of, a small little problem where you have to implement, one type of training, and we do that in software as opposed to a consultant, and people will spend some money on it and so on and so forth, and we'll be happy when a larger company sort of buys us. That would be the less attractive version, and I'm sure Roxanne will talk more about what they're actually building. And then the last sort of, if it goes people, market, people again, what we really try to understand is, are we going to be excited to be in business with these folks? And will they build something that we're proud to be associated with in the way they build it, not just the economic outcome? And, you try to do that in a condensed fashion because people are busy, they're fundraising. But I think, from our initial interactions, understanding their backgrounds, why they came together, Roxanne and her co-founder Anne, to build this, and, seeing them a little more informally after our first call. I got to see them sort of on another phone call in our lobby, kind of huddled up in the corner. Roxanne will also point out that I opened a door and physically knocked into her.
Physically attacked my co-founder.
So she's, held that over me and threatened to, sort of expose our physical interaction.
Yeah, but it's blackmail. It's blackmail.
It's blackmail. But we don't know. Sort of ironic given, what they're training on. But but seriously, I just saw these folks with kind of hustle and determination and not taking anything for granted. Like, it's that weird combination of, you don't want people who are sort of believing their company will exist only if somebody funds it. So you want a company that's in motion, and people who have a belief that this is going to be built one way or another, but who also like believe that nothing is a given, and that like effort matters a lot in addition to, picking the right market and intelligence and hard work, and so that was our sandwich. And, we invested in that round, and in every round that we've had the chance to since. As I sort of say, as an investor, I've never owned as much of their company as I've wanted.
That's a good sign. I think that you're investing in bets that you want to stick with. Roxanne, let me come back to you. I mean, Hunter kind of gave an overview of connecting with you and Anne as you were doing your initial fundraising, I believe in 2019. Take me back to the origin story. How did you and Anne connect? Where did this idea come from? And if you can kind of give the Redefiners a bit of a deeper dive into Ethena and the business and how you help those customers and clients with compliance and more.
Totally. Yeah. So I think what's unfortunate about our business is the phrase compliance training is one of the most boring phrases you can have. It's like a party ender. But kind of to Hunter's point, like what Anne and I got really excited about from our earliest days, sort of this idea of like, when you actually build culture, like it's about communication, right? It's about a company communicating to employees, like, here's what right looks like. Here's values at our company. Here's what we expect from you. And then it's also about an employee listening to their employees and hearing like, what do you guys think of this? Are there trends? And it's really just about like good communication back and forth, bi-directional. And in my mind, that's what good like training, for example, should be. But in my experience in the military, I had both the absolute best of training. I learned how to jump out of planes. I learned how to deploy to Afghanistan, like really world-class training. But also I would find myself like packed into an auditorium where someone would talk at us for 4 hours about like, don't sexually harass your colleagues. And then soldiers would make a bunch of jokes because the whole training was just, comical at best. And I thought like, what are we doing here? This is, a mess. We would talk about security training and don't post stuff on social media that you're not supposed to. And like all of this compliance training that we were getting at the same time that we were getting really good, like outcomes-based training for everything else. And I thought like, this is bizarre. Why do we train effectively on some stuff and then just do like really kind of cursory at best training for other things? Like kind of put it in the back of my mind as like, this is odd. And I can talk more about it, but also I was a woman in the Army. And so I just like experienced some of the things firsthand that we train on because the Army is like 14% women. And eventually got out, bootstrapped a company, went to McKinsey and found myself clicking through basically the same version of the auditorium stuff that I took in the Army. I joke it's like less cursing, but basically the same thing, more digital. It's like, well, McKinsey is, this like preeminent, consulting firm. And here we've got kind of your, don't do this insider trading, don't touch your colleagues. And he was like, well, this doesn't help me to navigate a conflict if I see one. And around the same time, I was experiencing an issue with gendered feedback and just noticed that my colleague like really wanted to do the right thing and support me, but was utterly unequipped despite having taken hours of mandatory training to do anything. And so that was like the kind of like kick in the pants I kind of needed to be like, you know what, like I've seen this problem like play out in every different forum. I don't see a better solution here. And if there was a better solution, McKinsey would have it. And that's what made me go find Anne in New York and bring her to Hunter.
Yeah. And so that you and Anne get together, do you kind of come to her with this idea? Did you formulate it together? Like walk me through those early days.
Yeah. So if you know my co-founder is like in some ways the opposite of me. She's incredibly thoughtful, methodical. She really like thinks things through. And I had this kind of like very lived experience and was like, there's got to be a better solution. Googled a little bit, was like, I don't know. I don't think there's a better solution. Run into a founder in New York who says like, you know what, you should start a company with this woman, Anne. I was like, great, never met her. What's her phone number? Like, she's going to be my co-founder. So I get her on, I think, a FaceTime at the time. This is sort of like pre-Zoom, pre-COVID, and just like tell her about this problem. And on the one hand, she totally sees it because she's taken her company's training and she's a woman software engineer. So sort of the same experiences I've had in special operations, she sort of had as a woman engineer, like weirdly similar worlds. But on the other hand, she's kind of asking some of the questions Hunter's asked, like, do you know any of the competitors? How big is this market? You have literally no experience in the law or HR, so I can see Anne just kind of like taking notes as I'm like seeing us 5 years in the future, like building this thing. And she's asking really practical, important, pragmatic questions. But thankfully she tells it like she just got kind of excited working with me, which as a kind of humble, bordering on insecure person makes me uncomfortable. But I'm really glad she did, because I think it ended up being more about like the people and the partnership. And I'm not sure if she thought the idea was that smart, to be totally honest. I think she was just kind of like, you know what, like I think that, we can at least try. And if it doesn't work, like it doesn't work, but let's give this a shot.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate the context on the origin story. And interesting that you two came together and had such a complementary yet different background.
Yeah.
Hunter, let me come back to you for a moment. Like, obviously, as an investor, you evaluate a range of different companies across a range of different sectors. But I want to narrow in on the work tech sector for a moment, like the HR tech sector. We've seen record levels of investment over, obviously, since the pandemic. I think it's really kind of centered the world of work broadly in a very different way than we ever had been in the past. And while the numbers, I think, of overall investment are not what they were at its peak, they're still at record levels for what our trend line tends to be. And I'm curious to get what's your perspective generally in kind of the work tech and HR tech space right now? What are maybe, are there certain verticals or areas that you expected to see more of that you're not? Maybe there's some people sitting on ideas out there that might need a spark of inspiration from you.
Yeah, sure. So my first investment in this space was before Homebrew. I was working at Google and YouTube and an occasional angel investor. And a former Googler started an ATS company called Lever that I thought, hey, he's smart. Like pragmatically, I've used this tool. Like we have a version of this that I have to enter candidates into at Google and that sort of thing. And it really wasn't with any sort of particular point of view on, all the good questions that, Roxanne mentioned and asked. I didn't have any idea who the competitors are in the ATS space were, who the buyers were, how much people paid for it. I just said, oh, this guy's smart and I like his co-founder. She's great too. And so through their ups and downs and eventually, ups, had a very nice exit recently, got to sort of see a little bit on the early years. Then when we came to Homebrew, Satya and I had a perspective that one of the best things about software over the last few decades, since sort of we started our careers to now, was the breadth of things that it can do and the industry and jobs functions it helps. So it wasn't any longer just startups building for other startups or startups building for tech companies or the largest enterprises because they can afford the cost, the custom build or the training, being able to buy quote unquote enterprise software. That you had this wonderful thing called cloud and SaaS and all this type of stuff that meant businesses of any size, could find software that was built for them or otherwise appropriate for them. And it was no longer just top down, read the Gartner group reports, who takes the head of HR to a steak dinner and then force it down on managers and teams. That actually, while of course executive sponsorship and buy-in is really important, that software could be built and sold bottom up, that it had to be at least tolerated, if not loved, by the people who used it. Otherwise, you would get, sort of your own sort of, lack of usage, engagement, and, could check the box, but not necessarily get the benefits from that software. And so it was clear when you sort of think about that rubric that, sort of quote unquote HR, people ops was going to be growing as a category because it was no longer just a set of check boxes. It was how do we run our business? That being said, we kind of divided our purview into sort of what I'd call back office and front office. Back office, in my mind, were the types of platforms that if you were spinning up a company, you somehow had to solve and run, either because you needed to affect, payroll, you had to somehow pay your team, or you were legally, past a certain size or in a certain state or in a certain industry, like needed to otherwise deliver a particular type of service or keep certain records because proactively or reactively it would be very costly or illegal for you not to. And so we made some investments in what I'd call sort of the back office space early. We were fortunate to be investors in Gusto, some other things there. And also in front office, which what I'd call sort of more kind of like discretionary or optional, but obviously still mission critical services. Those usually involve culture, feedback, training, management, one-on-ones, team building, all the things that if you like, maybe there's not a government agency telling you have to do this, but Darwin certainly is, in the sense that right. Companies that ignore this usually go out of business, and companies that do it well, don't. And so I think where this latest generation of entrepreneurs that's been really interesting is in some of this front office as well, where you have folks with maybe consumer software sensibilities. They're building high quality modern software, not just taking forms and bringing them from a PDF to clickable interactive software, but are still sort of results focused, understand how to build for orgs, understand all the things you have to do in enterprises, SOX compliance and reporting and analytics. And I'd say Ethena is one of the first that I'd sort of say in our mind is kind of has a back office wedge, increasingly nationally and in a bunch of states. If you're larger than a certain size, like you just don't have to do this well, you have to do it, period. But built with the notion of and vision of this isn't just the digitizing of the weird person who used to come to your office with a slide deck. And it's not just checking a box so that, when these issues occur, you can at least say, well, we did the training, so, we're not liable. But it's actually looking at efficacy of preventing these issues, growing and expanding, how we deliver it, when we deliver this, so that it's individual appropriate, company appropriate, stage appropriate. And that's what gets me excited. People who are kind of spanning this notion of, quote unquote, touchy-feely with a motivation on the buyer side that isn't just early adopter, isn't just hey, we have some discretionary budget to spend, but like has an evangelist, inside the company that knows that if they don't do this well, the company is at risk.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think that the general, impressions around the space and the vertical, Roxanne, as you mentioned, it's like a party killer, right? It's like compliance isn't a topic that people get excited about, but the way you frame it is very different. And I think even when you kind of go to your website and you see the framing around like building the future of ethical and inclusive workplaces,
yeah,
that's very different than the term that conjures a different emotion, that conjures a different feeling than the term compliance. And I'd love to get more context for you from like where that framing comes from and how you help clients operationalize that.
Yeah, what's nice is like customers gave us that framing. So I remember like really early on, I love this, with this early adopter at Netflix, John Hicks is his name. I've done some stuff with him. I'm sure he'll be embarrassed that I'm shouting him out, but he had this idea of like, yeah, of course it should be about culture. Like literally, what else are we doing if we're not kind of explaining standards? And I thought back to my time in the military, and every like kind of good commander I had was good like across the board. So meaning they were ethical, they were inclusive, they were like high performance oriented. Like it went hand in hand. I think it's kind of like quite rare to see situations where an organization is like really polished, except for like, man, we just don't interact well with women. And you're like, that's odd. Like that's a weird spike over there. Like I really think that leaders, when they kind of get down to like what does professionalism look like? Usually it's just kind of across the board. We want the best out of our people. And that means that, yeah, we can't be total jerks to a certain subset. And so it didn't feel like we were kind of trying to like pour it on some Pollyanna-ish view of the world onto our training. Instead, we were listening to customers. Remember this one early buyer, small tech company in Boston. She was the HR leader. And I told her about this idea, and she said, you know what, I've never done traditional compliance training at my company because I was embarrassed to put it out. I just couldn't do it. Like we're a 100-person tech company, really smart people, and I'm not going to sit there and give them some absurd like, Sally's going to report you to HR because you like went in an elevator with her kind of training. Like I just won't do it. And so she said until she saw Ethena, she just refused because she thought that training should be about setting standards and building culture and helping people interact more with each other. I mean, one of the many issues we face is like there's a lot of generations in the workforce, and generally we assume that people want to do the right thing and interact with their colleagues, but like often they don't know how, they don't know the new vocabulary. And so it's really about for us like finding a group of people who we weren't convincing or like twisting their arm. It was almost like sometimes they would tell me like, I thought someone would build this company 5 years ago, and like you finally came along and like you did it. And just like getting that group of people pretty energized. And then like kind of to Hunter's point, like if that was our only market, I think we'd be a little bit in a pickle. But thankfully, those people were like the early adopters, and they kind of evangelized. And also there were regulatory tailwinds, whether it's with harassment, whether it's with data privacy. Like there's just sort of all of these reasons, whether it's the DOJ coming out and saying like, FYI, if you're just doing really crappy, check the box, that is not going to cover you, which is not official legal language, but is absolutely the correct paraphrase. All of those trends have made it such that what the John Hickses of the world, what that HR woman of the world thought, 3.5 years ago is just like now considered more mainstream.
Yeah. It's interesting. I appreciate that anecdote you shared of the HR manager in Boston, because I think when you think about how the field of HR and people operations has evolved, right? And like right now, I kind of view the entire field as a spectrum, and you still have some of those personnel legacy policy cop stereotype. That totally. Function does exist, but it's a smaller subset. And then you have this, leading edge where they're fully integrated into every decision the business makes, not just
the
HR decisions.
Of the world.
Exactly. And the majority of the field is somewhere in the middle, but they have the opportunity to kind of move more towards that top end. And I think when you look at the tools that we have access to, we have cutting edge tools. I mean, Hunter mentioned Lever with, ATSs, where we're having all kinds of new AI tools coming out in the market, communication tools to support remote work and asynchronous collaboration and communication. But in this field, pre-Ethena, we really did it. And so I think, even if you had that best in class progressive team, and then you're putting your team through training that is from 2007, totally. Right? It hasn't really evolved at all, then it's a credibility hit. And no matter how I think progressive you are as a people function, the end delivery of what we deliver to our employees matters. And so if we're taking them in a time machine with some of the different training or resources that we provide to them, that's a hit on us.
Totally right.
So yeah, it's interesting.
The signaling alone is, really just a thing we've heard, whether it's training or we're actually about to announce roll out anonymous reporting. To me, it's kind of like the same exact thing, right? Like if you're a traditional HR and you're like, here's our dusty phone to call me if you have an issue, or like, here's a fax, like I really want to hear from you. And it's like, you're demonstrating that you don't. Like in the same way that if you put, a really just kind of outdated office style video in front of people once a year, and you say like, hope you're inclusive now, hope you're ethical, please don't insider trade. Like your actions are demonstrating that this isn't really something that you're invested in. And so I think that you're completely right that often it's just the signaling, like, employees are really perceptive to what their company cares about, and on the flip side, what their company does not care about. And so sometimes it can just be the signaling alone that is quite powerful.
Yeah, what we couldn't anticipate, when we first invested, we knew that the trend lines were sort of heading in the right direction. I think people were taking, harassment more seriously. There were a bunch of issues that people wanted to be proactive about, not just reactive. But, the shifting from a video or a human in the office, from a services model to a software model for this, obviously accelerated through the pandemic and persists afterwards, whether, you believe in remote, hybrid, in office, it just, people are now much more comfortable with the adoption of high quality software tools to aid or replace what used to be less effective, less customizable, sort of services models. And then also, these new modalities. I mean, it was funny, like, there's lots of different sort of like informal indicators of, potential success. One was when people started pinging me to get intros to Ethena for portfolio companies, or, a spouse who was an exec at a company who said, besides the generational aspect, like now that we're, a Zoom, a Slack, a so on and so forth, these other tools that were meant to help us have created all these different types of interactions that our legacy training and coaching doesn't cover. Some of it's as basic as like, can you keep your pants on when you Zoom and don't get on Slack after you've been drinking on a weekend, right? It's playing defense. But some of the offense was more like, how do we incorporate all these different kind of assumptions about how we work together and who is on the other side of that interface, that phone, that Zoom, that text thread, so that we can be effective leaders, effective managers, give feedback to people that we've never met before,
Yeah.
And that's where I think the fullest vision of, Ethena gets delivered. It's a no-brainer if you're just looking to be, effective and compliant. If you're interested in, growing the capacity and capability of your organization over time, so that you, don't churn your best folks, so that you become a place. I almost imagine that just like software developers, when they're deciding whether they want to go work somewhere, they ask about the tech stack and the tooling environment and can we bring our own tools, that, employees in general will sort of, be like, well, how seriously do you take training, culture, so on and so forth? And hey, we're an Ethena shop will sort of be one of the things that give new hires comfort that they take it seriously. And if, if the company has not yet implemented Ethena, like they will be bringing it over, well, hey, let me show you something that worked really well where I used to be. We should roll that out here.
Well, I think that
like you said, like the bottoms up and tops down. So I'm sorry, Roxanne, go ahead.
Well, I know I was just, as Sandra was talking, and Lars, I imagine like a lot of your audience deals with this, is thinking of this whole like return to work, are we, hybrid kind of thing, and all of the like new challenges that's brought up. One of the other new products we just rolled out is an LMS, and LMS has been around for a long time. We said we built ours just for kind of the purposes of you have to do this sort of training. And one of the reasons we did it is because people are really struggling with, like, I would call it the intersection of like legal and people right now. So one of the biggest issues we're hearing is like reasonable accommodations, ADA type issues in a hybrid workforce. So like you're bringing everybody back to the office, but some people for a variety of reasons might not want to go into the office, and like managers kind of being on the front line of these issues that 5 years ago you would never have had a discussion about this because it would have all happened at the recruiting stage. But now you're having managers perhaps like receiving information that is actually really important and could potentially result in, both like terrible employee experiences, but also lawsuits. And they're not getting the right amount of training for like, what do I do if someone is complaining? They might seem like small things. They're complaining about their back. They're saying that they don't have the childcare support to come into the office. And companies are like, we have policies for leaves of absence. We have policies for mental health. But if people don't know about them, we're kind of like having all of these issues that we only find out about when they have escalated to like quite a capital B, big concern instead of much earlier. So it's been really interesting to see companies actually just take our tech and say, we love your courses for our off-the-shelf stuff, but the way we do it at company X, we need to have like some really specific 5-minute training on leaves of absence, on stuff that like historically, I think I never would have really thought about. It's been really neat to see customers kind of guide that use case versus us say like, the state says you got to do
and
X
contextual.
or Y. Totally.
One of the most, one of the things, I'm not an expert in this industry. I'm not an expert in anything I invest in, thankfully. I invest in experts. But Roxanne and I were just sort of telling me about what once you break this from a monolithic training that's done annually, biannually, whatever, into sort of the compliance part, but like what happens when that person who you just sort of, trained a year ago about anti-bribery and, sort of rule sets, for doing business in other countries is about to take their first, international sales trip. And you can sort of proactively push, the relevant 5-minute video, back to, that sales group, not hope that they rely on it from a year ago or wait a year, to refresh the content. And so those are all the things that software, smart software allows you to do or does for you that, the old way of doing business, you can't possibly sort of be as flexible, personalized, or customizable. And so that's my glass half full has been fulfilled in a lot of ways, that they've built a software company, not a software enabled services business.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And look, when you think about learning today, snackable learning, the ability to create kind of modular learning that can be updated and refreshed and delivered as needed in moments when they're needed. That's radically different than how I think we approach learning in general, not even specifically from the client's compliance perspective. But I think,
Totally.
Learning was a classroom. It was a 4-hour module that was written 5 years ago,
Yeah.
right? And like the world that we're in right now is changing so rapidly, and that's not going to change. This is just going to continue to evolve, and we need to be much more agile with how we think about supporting HR leaders that are experiencing situations that in some cases they've never experienced before. And so the ability to, I think that the way that you're approaching things at Ethena allows you to meet those moments as they're happening and adjust as they need to be adjusted in ways that I think traditional platforms just can't.
That's right.
Hunter, I want to come back to you for a quick question, and then I want to have a wrap up for each of you. But I want to just get your perspective on the market in general right now. I mean, obviously, we've seen the tech space be hit pretty hard by layoffs over the last 12 to 18 months. Economic headwinds to some degree that we don't quite understand yet, but obviously a belt tightening. How are you advising, Roxanne and other portfolio founders about how they should be navigating their businesses through kind of just this period of economic uncertainty?
Yeah, boy, we could talk a lot about that. I'll give the simplest answer. The first question is the change in the market helping you or hurting you? And what I mean is I have a number of companies who are in categories such as, sales efficacy, right? High ROI, quick to value, and you have sales VPs who are saying, I've got the same quota, now fewer people, and a harder sales environment. So anything I can do that has, a 10x ROI, I can figure out where to get the budget, to spend on that software. So I actually have some companies that, whether it's countercyclical or just contrarian, do well. But my general sense to everybody is just to ask them, hey, do you have what I'd call sort of like a cap table problem? Do you have a valuation problem, or do you have a P&L problem? What I mean from a P&L problem is it a turnout that as people tighten their belts, your customers tighten their belts or aren't growing as quickly, or there's not as many new startups or things like that, that you have fallen out of product market fit, you are a less urgent purchase, that you are sort of relying upon, your customers growing their seats per customer, at a headcount growth rate that is, looking backwards over the last 3 years rather than looking forwards over the last few years. If you have a P&L problem, like, we have to relook at the plan. We have to relook at some core assumptions, and that could be anywhere from making sure that you're building something your customers actually need. So a real sort of take 2 steps back, in order to hopefully take steps forward later, to just, hey, this is going to have to last a little bit longer because we can't assume growth from your current customers quite as much. They're not going anywhere, but they're just not growing as quickly. And so let's shift more from, account management, post-sales to pre-sales, so that we can put spend into your funnel, that type of stuff. The folks who have more of just kind of like a cap table and culture question, maybe let's call it, like, the market's told you are worth a lot more. Now, now that just the multiple that's being applied to your business is a little bit different. Like, let's not overreact to that. Let's make sure that culturally your team understands that we're playing for the long game here. And if you're successful in your role, like, you're going to have a job here for a long time, and your equity, will be worth something at the end of the day, that this isn't a scratch and win lottery ticket. It's about getting to have ownership in the company that you're putting work into. And let's make sure, your investors aren't just fair weather friends. And those who were, like, let's not over listen to their feedback. And so if we have to go raise more money, quote unquote flat to the last round, or, a little bit of a down round, like, that's not a big deal. You'll still end up in the same place, which is building a successful business. So if I sound like sort of an optimist, I guess I am, because, everybody has their challenges, but, let's make sure we're categorizing the problem correctly and not just immediately switching into a defensive mode that's about just staying alive, but isn't worth the opportunity cost of spending time or dollars to build something that's ultimately going to be valuable. I don't care if you can extend your runway to, 1,000 months of cash on hand. If it means you're not building anything that's worth the time of smart people or that's eventually going to be worth something, in that case, I rather shoot our shot and see what happens in a smart, pragmatic way. So I guess I'm a little bit of a combination of Roxanne was defining herself as a little bit more gut oriented, and originally, her partner is a little more framework oriented. I guess I'm a little bit of both here, which is to say, let's all be looking at the same data, but we're playing to win, not just to survive.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And I'm going to wrap up with a quick lightning round. I have one question for each of you. And Roxanne, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah.
And lightning round, so I'm going to keep these answers to about a minute.
Okay.
What is something about Hunter that makes him a great investor and partner?
So here's what's great about Hunter. He often comes with more questions than answers. So what I mean by that is if I come to Hunter a year ago and I'm like, hey, Hunter, seems like the market is collapsing. He's not going to be like, what you should do? You should cut X number of employees and do this and do that. And instead, he's just going to ask a series of questions to kind of, one, better understand the situation, but two, kind of help Anne and I think about okay, here's some frameworks. And that might not sound revolutionary, but I think it can be really powerful because, investors have a lot of power, both soft power and capital. And I think that they can do best when they're really partnering with the company to figure out the solution versus just sort of saying I've got pattern recognition, I've seen this, here's the answer. I think Hunter's really empowered us to think about the right way to solve problems for us, and is never really come to us with some out of the blue, I read this on TechCrunch thoughts kind of a thing, and instead is really sought to understand the problem before providing any sort of diagnosis. And then also he shares my love of Taylor Swift, which is incredibly important.
I feel okay. I'm gonna spend some time on Spotify with Taylor later today, just so I can feel more a part of this and hold up the quizzes. Hunter, same question back to you. What is it about Roxanne that makes her a great leader and a CEO?
So a lot of the founders I meet have gotten there by working really hard and being really smart. And so they sort of think the way that they succeed when the business starts to grow is by working even harder and being even smarter. And that hits a ceiling. You can't find a 25th hour in a day. If any startups have solved that, please let me know. I'll invest them right now. And so they switch to a team mentality of how can I build a place that the smartest, best people want to work at? And that sounds so simple. But even that mentality switch of, in order for this to be what I hope it can be, it has to be bigger than me. Not just in headcount, I mean, that's the quantitative part, but in giving up some ownership, giving up some control, incorporating other people's ideas, learning when the buck stops with you as a CEO, but when also you have to trust that you've hired great people and they can make the decision. Roxanne is excellent at that. And that's what gives me sort of the confidence that she's not just building a company that is going to be valuable, but a company that's going to be valuable that she's going to be the leader of for the foreseeable future. And I think those two things are intertwined. It's causation, not just correlation, that kind of founder-built companies are also the most valuable ones.
All right, that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks so much to Roxanne and Hunter for joining us and giving us a window into the dynamic of a co-founder and CEO and an investment partner. You can learn more about Ethena at goethena.com. And that is a wrap for this week. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next week.